She was 18 and homeless, adrift in the dusty settlement of Red Rock, with nothing to her name but a worn leather satchel and the $27 her aunt had pressed into her hand as a final, sterile transaction. Her only inheritance was a deed to a worthless piece of land outside of town, a place her estranged grandmother had owned, a place distinguished only by the cracked and leaning ruin of a stone chimney. But what nobody knew, least of all Annie Carter herself, was that hidden deep within the soot-stained stones of that chimney was a secret that would not only give her a home, but a life. Settle in and stay close for this one. And in the comments, let us know what forgotten place holds a special meaning for you. Annie Carter learned the world through the grain of stone and the heft of a hammer. Her grandfather, Thomas Carter, was a stonemason, a man whose hands were maps of calluses and fine white lines of lime mortar, and he had been the whole of her world since her parents had been taken by river fever when she was 5. He had not been a man of many words, but he spoke a language of patience and precision. He taught her how to read a rock, to see its heartline, and the way it would cleave under the sharp tap of a chisel. He taught her that every stone had a face meant for the weather, and a bed meant for the mortar, and that a well-built wall was a conversation between the earth and a man's hands. They lived in a small, sturdy house he had built himself, on the outskirts of a more established town, a house with a foundation of granite fieldstone he and Annie had gathered from the creek bed together. He'd point with his thumb. "See that one, Annie girl? That's a keeper. Flat bed, good face. It'll sit right." And she would learn to see it too. Her most prized possession, carried in the deepest pocket of her satchel, was a small, smooth piece of river slate he had given her on her 10th birthday. It was dark gray and fit perfectly in her palm, and on its surface was the delicate, fossilized imprint of a trilobite, a creature turned to stone millions of years before. "Everything has a story," he'd told her, his voice a low rumble. "Even the stones. You just have to be patient enough to listen." He was her teacher, her father, and her only friend, a steady presence, as solid as the walls he built. But his lungs, long filled with the fine dust of his trade, finally gave out the winter she turned 18, and with his passing, the foundation of her own life crumbled into dust. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and cold as a winter morning. Her father's brother, Uncle Robert, and his wife, Aunt Maeve, had never approved of Thomas raising her. They saw him as a simple laborer, a man of dirt and stone, while they lived in town and valued clean hands and social standing. They arrived 2 days after the funeral, their faces set in masks of solemn duty. There was no argument, no shouting, just the rustle of papers on the kitchen table. Uncle Robert, a man who worked in a bank and smelled of starch and stale air, explained the situation with methodical cruelty. The house and the land it sat on were to be sold to cover Thomas's debts, which were, he assured her, considerable. Her inheritance, after all was settled, was twofold. First were the $27 in cash. Second was a brittle, folded deed to a piece of land far off in the Red Rock territory, a parcel that had belonged to her grandmother, Ilara, a woman she'd never met. Ilara had been disowned by the family for marrying Thomas, a common mason. The deed was, Aunt Maeve said with a thin, pitying smile, more of a sentimental curiosity than an asset. The land was worthless, she explained. Good for nothing but sagebrush and lizards. Annie didn't speak. There was nothing to say. She stood in the home her grandfather had built, the air still thick with the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, and the wood smoke from the hearth he'd laid stone by stone, and felt herself being erased. The next morning, a small, neatly packed suitcase was waiting for her on the porch. It contained her few changes of clothes. She left it there. She went to her room, took her own worn leather satchel, placed the trilobite stone inside, and tucked her grandfather's small, perfectly balanced mason's hammer into the loop on the side. Then she walked away from the house, down the dirt lane, and did not look back. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, and she had only $27 and a worthless piece of land to her name. She had work to do. The journey to Red Rock was a lesson in dust and distance. For 2 days, she walked the rutted track that passed for a road, the sun beating down on her head and the leather strap of her satchel cutting into her shoulder. The world she had known, a place of green river valleys and familiar faces, gave way to a starker landscape of red earth, twisted juniper trees, and vast, indifferent skies. On the 3rd day, a freight wagon driver named Elias Finch, a man with a kind face and a beard full of trail dust, took pity on her and offered her a ride on his buckboard. He shared his water and a piece of dry bread, asking few questions, and for that Annie was grateful. He spoke of Red Rock as a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go, a hardscrabble settlement built on hope and failure in equal measure. "It's a tough place," he said, his eyes on the horizon, "but it's honest. It don't pretend to be anything it ain't." When they finally crested the last rise, Annie saw it below, a handful of raw lumber buildings scattered along a dry creek bed, huddled beneath a towering mesa of red rock that glowed like a hot coal in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of pine, dust, and the sharp tang of a blacksmith's forge. It was not welcoming, but as Elias had said, it was honest. She thanked him for the ride, slid down from the wagon, and walked into the settlement, her boots kicking up small puffs of red dust. She felt the eyes of the few people on the street follow her. A stranger, a young woman, alone. She ignored them, her gaze fixed ahead. Her first stop was the Territorial Land Office, a small, hot room that smelled of paper and ink. The clerk, a balding man with sweat stains under his arms, barely looked up as he stamped her deed and pointed on a map to a small square marked with the name E. Carter. "It was a mile north of town," he said, on the high bench overlooking the creek. She bought a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a canteen of fresh water from the general store, the transaction leaving her with just over $22. Then she followed the clerk's directions, walking out of the small cluster of buildings and up a winding path onto the high bench. The land was exactly as her aunt had described it, a windswept acre of packed red earth, dotted with stubborn clumps of sagebrush and a few scraggly pines. It was worthless, but then she saw it, standing alone near the center of the plot, silhouetted against the vast blue sky, was the chimney. It was perhaps 12 feet tall, a solitary column of stone where a house had once stood or had been meant to stand. A jagged crack ran up its western face, and the mortar was crumbling in places, but it was still standing, defiant against the wind and the years. Annie walked toward it slowly, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. It was made of river rock and fieldstone, gray and brown and rust-colored stones of all shapes and sizes, fitted together with a skill that was both art and engineering. She ran her hand over the rough, sun-warmed surface. She recognized the work. She saw the way a long, flat stone was used as a tie, locking the smaller stones around it into a stable whole. She saw the subtle batter, the slight inward slope of the walls that gave it strength. She saw the careful placement of a small, oddly shaped white quartz rock right next to the hearth opening, a decorative touch, a signature. It was her grandfather's work. There was no doubt. He had been here. He had built this. This worthless piece of land held the last thing he had ever built, and suddenly, it was the most valuable thing in the world. That night, she rolled out her blanket at the base of the chimney, the stone at her back, still holding the day's warmth. And for the first time since he had died, she did not feel entirely alone. The next morning, Annie woke with a clear and simple purpose. She would not sell the land. She would not leave. She would repair the chimney. It was a piece of him, and she would not let it fall. She spent the morning clearing the debris from around its base, pulling up weeds and carting away the few rotted pieces of timber that lay half buried in the dirt. The foundation, she was relieved to find, was solid, set deep into the earth. The crack was serious, but not fatal. A mason who knew what they were doing could fix it. As she worked, she began to imagine a small house built against it, a one-room cabin with the great stone hearth as its heart. It was a foolish, impossible dream, but it kept her hands moving. She began to clean out the hearth itself, scooping out decades of old ash, leaves and dirt that had blown inside. It was choked with debris. As she dug deeper, her fingers brushed against something hard and square. It was a loose stone at the back of the firebox, a dark, soot-stained piece of granite that was not set with mortar like the others. Her grandfather had taught her to listen to the stones. She took out his small hammer and tapped it gently. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the dull thud of stone against stone, but a hollow, resonant echo. Her breath caught in her throat. Using the claw of the hammer, she worked it carefully into the seam around the stone, prying gently. The stone shifted. With a final effort, it came loose, scraping against its neighbors. Behind it was a dark, square cavity. Reaching a trembling hand inside, her fingers brushed against cold, smooth metal. She pulled it out. It was a heavy tin box, rusted at the corners but still solid, held shut with a simple latch. She carried it out into the sunlight and sat on the ground, her heart pounding against her ribs. With fumbling fingers, she opened the latch. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled in dry oilcloth, were stacks of gold coins, neatly wrapped in paper rolls, and on top of them, a thick, folded envelope with the name Annie written on it in a careful, elegant hand. She opened the letter first, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfold the paper. The handwriting was her grandmother's, but the words were from them both. My dearest Annie, if you are reading this, it means the world has been harder on you than we ever hoped, and we are no longer there to help. For that, I am so sorry. Your grandfather Thomas built this hearth and chimney the year before you were born. We bought this small piece of land with what little we had, a secret place, a hope for a future your family would never have allowed us. Thomas wanted to build a whole house for us here, a new start, away from the judgment and the cold shoulders. But his lungs grew bad, and we never got the chance. He built the chimney first. He always said a house begins with the hearth. It is the heart, he said, that keeps the cold out. He built this hiding place into it. He said a good mason always leaves a secret. Inside this box is every dollar I was able to save, over 20 years of mending and washing for the fine ladies in town. It is not a fortune, but I hope it is enough for a start. Enough for lumber, perhaps. Enough for a roof over your head that is truly your own. Your grandfather loved you more than words can say. He saw his own strength and patience in you. He used to watch you playing with stones in the yard, and he would smile. She has the eye for it, Elara, he'd say. She sees how things fit together. We hoped you would never need this, that your aunt and uncle would do right by you. But we knew their hearts. They are small, frightened people. Do not let their bitterness poison you. This land is not worthless. It is a beginning. The chimney is strong. Your grandfather built it to last. Let it be the heart of your home. Know that you were loved, Annie. You were loved fiercely. With all our hearts, Elara and Thomas Carter. Annie read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. It was not the money that broke her open, but the words. You were loved fiercely. She clutched the paper to her chest, the sound of her own quiet sobs lost in the vast, empty landscape. She was not an orphan left with nothing. She was the heir to a love story, a secret plan, a final gift left in a heart of stone. The gold coins were not just money. They were years of her grandmother's quiet labor. The chimney was not a ruin. It was a foundation. After a long time, she carefully folded the letter and put it back in the box. Then she stood up, wiped her eyes on her sleeve, and looked at the chimney, her chimney, and knew exactly what she had to do. She was going to build her house. The next day, Annie walked back into Red Rock, no longer an outcast, but a woman with a purpose, and the means to achieve it. Her first stop was the lumber mill at the edge of town, a sprawling, noisy place that smelled richly of sawdust and pine sap. The owner, Silas Blackwood, was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with hands as gnarled as oak roots. He watched her approach with skeptical eyes, leaning against a towering stack of freshly cut planks. Annie did not waste time. She laid out her hand-drawn plan on a stump, a simple square for a one-room cabin, the dimensions carefully measured to fit against the chimney's base. She explained what she needed: foundation posts, floor joists, wall framing, siding, and roof beams. Silas listened without interruption, his gaze shifting from the drawing to her face and back again. He pointed a thick finger at her drawing of the roofline. "You've got the pitch steep," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Good, sheds the snow. Where'd you learn to draw a plan?" "My grandfather taught me," Annie said simply. "He was a stonemason," Silas grunted, a sound of grudging respect. He quoted her a price, fair but not cheap. Annie opened her satchel and paid him in gold coin, counting the pieces into his wide palm. His eyebrows shot up, but he asked no questions. It was not the way of Red Rock. He promised to deliver the lumber to her plot the following morning. As she turned to leave, he called after her. "That chimney of yours, the old Carter chimney, it's got a bad crack." "I know," Annie said. "I'm fixing it." He just nodded, a new light in his eyes. Her next stop was the general store, run by a widow named Martha Gable. Martha was a kind, bustling woman who saw the hardness in Annie's eyes and the resolve beneath it. Annie bought nails, a good crosscut saw, a level, and a sack of lime to mix her own mortar. It was a large purchase, and Martha helped her bundle it. "Building something out there?" she asked, her voice gentle. "A home," Annie replied. Martha smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "You let me know if you need anything else," she said. "Your credit is good here." The offer was a quiet gift, a thread of trust offered to a stranger, and Annie felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. The rebuilding was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. The lumber arrived as promised, and Annie set to work with a singular focus. The first task was the chimney. She spent 2 days carefully chipping out the old, crumbling mortar along the crack, cleaning the stones until they were bare. Then, mixing the lime, sand, and water in a wooden trough, she made a fresh batch of mortar, the familiar, earthy smell filling the air and reminding her of her grandfather. She worked from the bottom up, forcing the new mortar deep into the crack with a trowel, setting small, carefully chosen stones into the larger gaps, keying the two sides of the crack together until they were one solid mass again. It was his work, and now it was hers, their hands joined across time by the same craft. When the chimney was stable, she began the house. She dug the post holes, set the foundation posts, and with immense effort, leveled the floor joists. A man named Jedediah Stone, an old prospector with a shock of white hair, who lived in a small shack down by the creek, wandered up one afternoon to watch her work. He watched for an hour as she struggled to notch a large beam with her saw. Finally, he spat a stream of tobacco juice and said, "You're fighting the wood, girl." He disappeared and returned with a heavy, sharp tool called a broadaxe. Without another word, he showed her how to stand on the log and hew the face flat, how to let the weight of the axe do the work, the big, clean chips of wood flying with each swing. He stayed for 2 hours, teaching her the rhythm of it, and then left as quietly as he had come. Annie never forgot the lesson. She raised the walls one by one, a skeleton of timber that slowly grew into the shape of a room. Martha Gable would sometimes walk up from town with a jar of cool water or a fresh loaf of bread, her presence a quiet blessing. Silas Blackwood delivered a second load of lumber, planks for the roof, and stayed long enough to help her raise the main ridge beam, his brute strength making a task that would have taken her days into an hour's work. They did not speak of friendship or community, but it was being built all the same, nail by nail, beam by beam, right alongside the house. The day the roof was finished, a sense of profound peace settled over Annie. She had done it. She had built a home. It was small, just one room, but the walls were square, the floor was solid, and the roof was tight. The great stone chimney stood as its anchor, a monument of love and endurance. That evening, she built the first fire in the newly repaired hearth. She stacked the kindling and logs, just as her grandfather had taught her, and when she set a match to it, the flames caught and roared to life. the smoke drawing perfectly up the flue and rising in a thin, straight line into the twilight sky. The fire filled the small cabin with a flickering, golden light and a deep, comforting warmth. It was the heart of her home, now beating strong. Over the next few months, Annie's life took on a new rhythm. She became a part of Red Rock, not just a stranger passing through. People no longer saw her as the homeless girl, but as Annie Carter, the one who built her own place. Her skill with stone became known, and soon she was being asked to repair a crumbling well lining for the blacksmith, or to lay a new stone foundation for an addition to Martha's store. She worked for pay, for barter, for the simple satisfaction of the work itself. She traded a new hearth for the storekeeper, for a winter's worth of flour and salt pork. She repaired Silas Blackwood's front steps, and he gave her a milk cow, a gentle Jersey, with soft brown eyes. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. Her life woven into the fabric of this small, tough community. They were people who respected work, and Annie Carter worked as hard as any man among them. Her small cabin became a true home, filled with the smell of baking bread, drying herbs, and the constant, steady warmth of the fire. The unwanted inheritance, the symbol of her family's rejection, had been transformed from a burden into a refuge, a source of dignity and quiet strength. A year to the day after she arrived in Red Rock, a deep snow fell, blanketing the high bench in a thick layer of silent white. Inside her cabin, Annie sat in a simple wooden chair she had made herself, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The room was warm and safe, a fortress against the cold and the wind that howled outside. The light of the fire glinted off the smooth surface of the trilobite fossil, which sat on one end of the rough-hewn mantelpiece. On the other end sat a small, heart-shaped river stone she had found while digging the foundation, a stone she imagined her grandmother might have noticed and smiled at. Between them, the fire burned. She thought of her aunt and uncle, not with the sharp pain of anger anymore, but with a distant, quiet understanding. They had given her what they thought was nothing, a final dismissal, an acre of dust and a pile of broken rocks. They had meant to cast her out, to leave her with no foundation at all, but they had unknowingly sent her to the only true inheritance she had ever had. They had sent her back to her grandfather, to his last work, and through him, to the grandmother she had never known. They had sent her to a place where her own two hands were worth more than a family name. Annie Carter was 19 now. She had arrived in Red Rock with $27 and a broken heart. She had spent it all on a future she couldn't see, on a pile of stones that everyone else saw as a ruin. It was the best investment she had ever made. The chimney stood, solid and true, its smoke a steady prayer against the cold winter sky, the heart of a home built by a love that even death could not destroy. This story is a testament to the idea that what we inherit is not always what is written on paper, but what is built with love and hard work. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might find strength in it. And now we ask you, what is the most valuable thing you've ever built with your own two hands? It doesn't have to be a house. It could be a garden, a friendship, or a new beginning. Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. Thank you for being here with us today.